I wanted to talk about a part of the election campaign that really hasn't received much attention so far this year, and that is a party called the Australian Greens. Pretty surprising how they've been on the quiet this election campaign when you think back to 2010 and just after the election then, which was kind of their zenith. Remember, in September 2010, the Greens had just won their first lower house seat, the seat of Melbourne. They'd established the balance of power unfettered in the Senate, and because of this power and their success, they actually went into a formal alliance with the Labor government. Julia Gillard signed them up to a formal alliance and they shared power with Labor. That was really the beginning of the end in many ways for the Greens and for Julia Gillard, because it generated the carbon tax and the media regulation inquiry and all that sort of thing. But anyway, that's where the Greens started, and this election they look like having a much tougher time. They're sinking in the polls a bit compared to where they were back then, and they run the risk of actually losing that balance of power in the Senate. They could, if enough minor party candidates and independent candidates get up in the Senate, you could see the situation where an Abbott government actually had another route through the Senate. They could sideline the Greens and the Labor Party and pick off some other independents and minor parties to get legislation through the Senate on some issues. So it's very important for the Greens to try and hang on to that balance of power, and one of the ways they need to do that is to try and make sure that they win the seat in South Australia currently held by Senator Sarah Hanson-Young. They need to protect her seat. So the Greens have got a bit of money, they want to protect that balance of power, and they're spending it on television advertisements to try and save Sarah Hanson-Young's career in South Australia. Well, let's have a look at a television commercial that's been running in South Australia, and we'll talk afterwards about a couple of things that are wrong with it.
If you're thinking of voting for Nick Xenophon, think again. This election, Nick Xenophon's giving his preferences to the Liberals before the Greens. That's a leg up for Tony Abbott to win control of the Senate. Vote for the party which is going to stop major party domination of our parliament. Vote 1, the Greens, Sarah Hanson-Young, in the Senate.
If you're fed up with the major parties, vote for someone who stands up for what matters. Vote Green in the Senate.
Authorised by A. Neil, Australian Green, SA, Adelaide.
Well, there are a couple of things wrong with that ad. One of the ones is suggesting that a vote for Nick Xenophon, the South Australian Independent, actually helps the Liberal Party. Nick Xenophon's very keen to point out that he splits his preferences equally between Liberal and Labor, so the ad is misleading in that way. But most importantly, of course, the man fronting the ad is a former politician. He's not the Greens leader. That's Bob Brown, who actually left the Parliament over a year ago. So how well are the Greens going when they don't even use their current leader, Christine Milne? Remember Senator Christine Milne? She's their current leader. She doesn't get a run in the ad. They run instead with Senator Bob Brown. Now, the other thing about the way the Greens are running to try and get Sarah Hanson-Young elected is preferences. We all know that preferences and the way the parties allocate their preferences in the Senate are very important, because most of us just tick the number 1 at the top of the line. We don't vote below the line. Now, they've really done some strange things with their preferences in South Australia. They know that Nick Xenophon is a force and they can't defeat him completely, so he gets a reasonable Senate preference. But what the Greens have done is they've split off his running mate, a bloke called Sterling Griff, and they've whacked him way down the list of preferences and put some pretty kooky characters above Sterling Griff, that is Nick Xenophon's running mate. So the Greens find themselves actually preferencing the Clive Palmer party, for instance, the party of a mining magnate, the guy who wants to dig up more coal and build a new Titanic. The Greens are preferencing his party ahead of Nick Xenophon's running mate. And just to cap it all off, if you look at the last 2 spots on their preference Senate allocations before they go to Nick Xenophon's running mate, they're 2 candidates from the No Carbon Tax Climate Skeptics Party. That's right, the No Carbon Tax Climate Skeptics Party get their preferences, 61 and 62, ahead of Nick Xenophon's running mate. Now, there's only 2 things that could be at play here. That is, the Greens must really, really hate Nick Xenophon and his running mate, or they could be complete hypocrites when it comes to climate change, or possibly both.